Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session of our Best Practices Guidance for Advancing Research Initiatives and Combating the Synthetic Drug Epidemic workshop series. This is session 3, our final session. We've entitled this session Interpretative Toxicology for NPS in Forensic Casework. This online workshop series is focused on sharing information with the forensic analytical community to promote improved capabilities for NPS detection and measurement, as well as outreach to human and public health agencies and practitioners to promote better understanding of patterns of NPS use, diagnosis, and treatment in the emergency room, and understanding of their role in determination of cause and manner of death. By collecting and sharing information with emergency room physicians, medical toxicologists, and epidemiologists. The goal of this workshop series is to provide resource materials and promote a better understanding to the forensic science practitioner community of evidence-based best practices regarding the synthetic drug epidemic. My name is Josh Vickers, and I am with RTI International, and I will be your moderator and host for today's session. We're going to jump right into it. Our first presenter of the day is Robert Middleberg. We'll wait for his title slides to come up, and we will introduce him. Dr. Middleberg will be presenting on general approaches to toxicological interpretation in medico-legal death investigation with a focus on NPS cases. Dr. Middleberg is the Vice President of Quality Assurance, Laboratory Director, and a practicing forensic and clinical toxicologist at NMS Labs. He served as a postdoctoral fellow in forensic toxicology at NMS Labs after completing his doctoral studies in pharmacology at Thomas Jefferson University and Medical College in Philadelphia in 1990. Prior to his doctoral degree and after earning a master's degree in chemistry from the University of Pittsburgh in 1982, he was an analytical forensic chemist for the Commonwealth of Virginia's Bureau of Forensic Sciences. He does currently sit on the board of directors for the American Board of Forensic Toxicology and the American Board of Clinical Chemistry, and has served as toxicology section chair in the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. In 2013, he was awarded the Rolla N. Harger Award by the toxicology section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences for his contributions to the field and profession of forensic toxicology. And without any further ado, I would like to welcome to the microphone and the floor Dr. Robert Middleberg.
Thank you very much, Josh. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I want to thank you for attending today's session. My presentation today is going to be, for some of you, rather rudimentary, but I think I'm more or less setting the stage for some of our following presenters so that we all have an equal ground. I know people are approaching this, I've been told, from all kinds of different backgrounds, so I thought I'd spend most of the time talking about toxicological interpretation in medical legal death investigation and have some information about NPS cases, but I know a lot of what's going to follow really will hone in on that. So with that, as is normal these days, I have no disclosures. So starting with some basics of the role of toxicology in terms of medical legal death investigation, what are we supposed to be doing? Ultimately, our role is meant to see if a toxin or toxicant, and there is a difference between the two. If you don't know, a toxin is something of natural origin, a toxicant is something that man has made. See if there's a toxin or toxicant that can contribute to a cause of death. Now, of course, the toxicologist does not determine cause of death. That is a pathologist's job. But we provide information, along with others, that help them reach those kinds of conclusions. So I thought I'd start with a case, and you can see there's a man lying here, and seemingly, of course, he appears to be dead. But if we look Right here, we will see something, and if I go to the next slide, it's a close-up of what we see, and that looks like a homemade needle that has been stuck in his arm. So generally, when I show a slide like this and I ask people, what's going on here, what do you think happened, and almost exclusively people say, well, he must have been injecting heroin, or something today. If you look at novel psychoactive substances, perhaps a fentanyl derivative or something like that. So the reality of things is when we have cases like this, seemingly it could be obvious. And when we look at that case again, if indeed analyses are done both on the syringe and in the individual, and we say we find a fentanyl derivative that's common on the street these days, we would say, okay, we've confirmed what we believe. But sometimes we say, I thought it was obvious, and you look at these things and you say, well, he's supposed to have heroin or an opioid or some other novel psychoactive substance or something we know about in him, but we don't find anything. And all of a sudden it's not so obvious. And then the last case is, I just call it obvious schmobvious, in that you analyze the syringe, you find heroin in it, but in the individual you find cyanide. So clearly there's a disconnect between the syringe and what's in this individual. And while toxicology has done its job in so much as providing information to the medical examiner as to what is a potential cause of death, obviously there are a lot of other questions that have to be answered then. So oftentimes we try to take a more scientific approach to things. We don't like to take a shotgun approach. It's a little expensive, it's time consuming, so we try to hone in on things as best we can. And our job oftentimes is to either exclude or include a toxin or toxicant. And we always have to remember that we are providing a piece of information amongst many pieces of information that a medical examiner and death investigators and law enforcement will use to draw some sort of conclusions. It's not that we are the determiners, we are providing information. So what are the problems with postmortem toxicology? And as you will see, if you don't know already, there are very, very many problems in terms of what we do and the information we provide. So I just thought I'd show a case. Here's a free morphine level of 900 nanograms per milliliter. And for those of you who have been practicing in the field, you would know that that's a fairly high concentration of morphine. And most people, as you look at it as a number on a piece of paper, you might say, well, oh boy, that would represent a cause of death in somebody. And then you find out that the cause of death is really metastatic cancer. And the manner of death is determined to be natural. And it turns out that the person was in hospice. So the point here is that a number on a piece of paper, whether it be morphine or a novel psychoactive substance, really should not be taken at face value. And unfortunately, a lot of people do. And I'll show you later on when you look at tables that it's a little dangerous to just take these numbers and just start to interpret them without additional information. So continuing on with the problems, we can break them down into pre-analytical and analytical and then interpretive. And we look at pre-analytical problems, and here's a paper that was published a few years ago at this point. That it's entitled Dominance of Pre-Analytical over Analytical Variation for Measurement of Methadone and its Main Metabolite in Postmortem Femoral Blood. So I'm not going to go through the paper, but I'll summarize it in that when looking at error in terms of what we see and things that can contribute to the interpretation of the measurements of analytes that we make, oftentimes it has nothing to do with the analysis. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of our regulating bodies and some of the things we are being required to do anymore in postmortem toxicology in terms of uncertainty of measurement. But what this paper essentially tells you is anywhere from 96+% of any error in any given case of results actually has nothing to do with what happens in a toxicology lab, but everything to do with what happens before a sample even comes to a toxicology laboratory. So for example, what's the anatomical site for a sample collection? Many of you will know that it makes a big difference whether you're collecting heart blood or whether you're collecting peripheral blood from some source, and even peripheral bloods are not immune to problems, and peripheral blood in the leg is not equal to subclavian peripheral blood. Some people call that peripheral blood, some don't. So there are a lot of problems with anatomical sites of collection because drug concentrations do not stay static after we die. They do change. And there are other things that can cause changes, such as accident and trauma and things like that. A delay between death and autopsy, whether it's days or if somebody's not found for weeks, that can contribute heavily to problems with how to interpret some of the findings we have, let alone if analyses are being performed in a badly decomposed body. There are a lot of problems analytically with doing that kind of a thing. Analyte stability and whether somebody actually collects specimens in a proper collection vessel. If you want to analyze for alcohol and you're not putting it in a gray top that has oxalate or fluoride or something similar to it, you run the risk of alcohol formation, of course, in postmortem blood. So again, these are pre-analytical things that happen before the sample even comes to the laboratory. Contamination. In an autopsy suite, perhaps somebody is not as careful as they should be, and they're reusing syringes. Well, there's contamination from one case to another potentially. It's not supposed to happen, but I have seen cases in my career where it has, as have all long-standing practicing forensic toxicologists. When you're looking for metals, metals are heavily suspect to contamination. And so you got to be careful there too. And there are a bunch of other things. So these are all things that happen again before a sample even makes it to the laboratory. When we look at analytical issues, getting standard reference materials, especially for these novel psychoactive substances, is very problematic. Some groups try to keep up. You wonder how they are able to keep up so fast and synthesize things so fast, their purity and so forth and so on. So finding standard reference materials is a real challenge for us. And regulatory bodies these days are making it more and more difficult along the lines of traceability to say that you have found something or you've quantitated something properly. Finding internal standards in mass spectrometry today, which is the state of the art for the most part for what we do. Looking for isotopically labeled internal standards can be a real challenge, especially for the novel psychoactive substances. No one's really rushing to synthesize those. You have the cost of research and development and validation. I know we can estimate for our facility that to bring a new test on board, a new analyte, add something to a test, it can run anywhere from $30,000 to $60,000. And if you were to stop and do the math in your own laboratories, you would see how that adds up very quickly. Between the development time and people's time and the cost of supplies, it gets very, very expensive. We have lab-to-lab inconsistencies, and even though there are regulating bodies that are supposed to smooth things like that out, we still see that. And we have to deal with regulations. We have now two ISOs, 17025 or 15189. Both are valid in what we do. And they are dictating certain things such as uncertainty of measurement and other details of our analytical process that have to be covered. Uncertainty of measurement, those of you who know me know that it's not something that I'm the biggest fan of, especially in post-mortem work. Again, when you know that 96 to 99% of all error is pre-analytical, it's sort of a ruse and a little bit to give some analytical certainty when you know that most of the error you're not even accounting for. And then we have standards and guidelines that come out to us, first through SWIG talks and now through the OSAC committees, at NIST, at least in the States. And these are things that are of tremendous value to the field. And I think they will help bring more consistency to what it is we do. Then we have interpretation of results. What does any given result mean? And that may sound like, well, why is that difficult? Well, for a lot of the reasons I've already been discussing, it's a problem. And so what are the kinds of things that make this so darn hard? And none of the novel psychoactive substances are immune to this, but we have post-mortem redistribution. In other words, site-to-site changes of toxins and toxicants in the body after death. Diffusion from one site to another can take place. When you get a finding of an opioid, a novel psychoactive opioid, what does it mean in terms of the individual? Are they tolerant to some things? You never know for any given individual if they're tolerant. There is no chemical test, at least that's available on a ready basis right now, that will tell us about somebody's tolerance. We have to deal with things like embalming and disinterring, and all of these things make our job very difficult in terms of interpretations. So here's an example. And these are two real examples from cases I've worked. So we have a fentanyl finding of 9.4 nanograms per milliliter. And in the old days, you would say, well, that seems like a reasonable cause of death. So this is a gentleman who was recently started on a fentanyl patch, and shortly after his second patch, he was found in bed, dead in bed. And that's a pretty common scenario, actually. It's usually the second patch, and usually several hours after that is when somebody might succumb to fentanyl. And the cause of death was signed out as fentanyl toxicity, and the manner of death was accident. And here's another case. Fentanyl, 56 nanograms per milliliter. In my cases, that's the highest fentanyl concentration that I've ever seen in a case. And this is an individual who was found with a patch on the body, and the reason was unknown. No other medical history was available. And the cause of death was blunt force trauma. They were hit by a train. So, and the manner of death is accident. So when you look at these two cases side by side, you say, well, on the surface of things, 56 nanograms per milliliter should have been a competent cause of death, most likely. But again, the cause of death here was being hit by a train. And all this is meant to do is to point out all the different problems that we routinely see in forensic toxicology in respect to trying to interpret findings and the difficulties. No two cases are the same. You can get the same exact finding in two different cases, and it means two completely different things. So when you throw in the difficulty of novel psychoactive substances, it becomes even more challenging for some of the reasons I'm going to tell you about in just a minute. So oftentimes what we like to do is rely on case reports that we see out in the literature and tables that are available. Case reports, it's pretty much been concluded that case reports are of limited value to us in interpreting postmortem findings, especially when you look at the novel psychoactive substances. It's good to get data out in the universe for sure, but they have limited value from case to case since each case is unique and different. And when we talk about tables, many of you would have seen tables like this through the years. People put out tables at the top. There are a couple columns that say therapeutic or normal, and then toxic, and then lethal. We know today that there's such crossover with many of these substances between what would be considered therapeutic, what is considered toxic, and what is lethal, that it renders these tables almost instantaneously useless. When you look at the novel psychoactive substances, how do you come up with a therapeutic or normal value? They're not supposed to be there. They're not used medically for the most part, most of them. So determining or differentiating what's normal, toxic, lethal becomes a real challenge and a real conundrum for us. And hopefully this presentation, and more so those that follow, will add some clarity to that. So not only do we have reports and tables, but then we have this: the disposition of toxic drugs and chemicals in man. And for many people, this is where it begins and this is where it ends, the knowledge of toxicology and what to do with a case result. And this is a phenomenal book. It's now in its 11th edition. I had the privilege of reviewing this edition for the Journal of Analytical Toxicology, and it remains a classic textbook for all of us to use. However, it's really a start, and I like to teach young toxicologists, this is a place to start, a place to get some basic information, and then know where to go farther. So reliance on this as the Bible of know-all to be-all in toxicology is not really a very good idea either. And I think Dr. Baselt, knowing him, would actually tell you so. So what do we do? What do we end up doing then with all these challenges? Well, we have to recognize that while the analytical part is all science, the interpretive part becomes part art. And the most basic textbook in toxicology, Casseret and Jewell's Toxicology, if you read the very introduction to it, will tell you that toxicology itself is both science and art. So what differentiates, one individual from another perhaps resides more in the art part than the science. So what do? We take a holistic approach and understand right from the get-go that no two cases are the same. Perhaps the best thing that could help us is case history. The more information, the better. Medical history, if it's available. And I just say information, 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 much like real estate where it's location, location, location. For us, it's really information, information, information. We have to take into consideration the pre-analytical issues. We have to take into consideration analytical issues and almost anything else that can affect the case. And I think if you've been doing this long enough, you will have seen so much strangeness and weirdness from case to case that you get to understand this, and this hits home pretty hard. Consider ourselves part of a team between the medical examiners, the medical death investigators, law enforcement, attorneys. It's only through cooperative efforts, excuse me, can we hope to get close to the right answer. Whether we ever hit the right answer or not is a good question, but we can at least get as close as we can. Be scientific in our approaches to these things and be a scientist. Obviously not an advocate, that's none of our jobs, but our jobs is to be a scientist. And one of my mentors, Dr. Frederick Reeders, taught me very early on in my career, don't walk the fence. It doesn't help anybody to be equivocal, or I should say unequivocal. You want to aim to be unequivocal in what you're doing. In other words, don't be wishy-washy. Don't give opinions here, there, and they're all over the place. If you don't know, you don't know, and that's okay. And I'll show you that soon. So what makes NPS so challenging in our postmortem work? Well, obviously we have a lack of pharmacological and toxicological data. We're starting to accumulate it, but most of it is case-based. There are some, I guess, a few studies out there, controlled studies, I guess we could call them, maybe, but there's not a whole lot of that. So that makes this very, very difficult. It's not like a new drug that's coming to market out of the pharmaceutical industry. The landscape changes from, I used to think, month to month or year to year, but now we know sometimes it's day to day. And keeping up with that and accumulating data is very, very difficult. So what does your opinion mean when you look at these things, especially with the novel psychoactive substances? It's important to understand that what your opinion does can have tremendous impact on a family. I got a phone call just yesterday about somebody, a father who is investigating his son's death because he's not satisfied with what took place like it was supposed to. And families have trouble understanding that their children, their loved ones, get involved with these materials, the novel psychoactive substances, and what it can do to them. You just have to turn on the news every day. Washington, D.C. last week, Philadelphia just today in the newspaper about people coming in contact with these substances and having some very, very poor outcomes. And oftentimes in law enforcement, it can lead to, our opinions can lead to distribution charges against somebody for giving somebody a substance that results in their death. So very, very serious opinions that we give have very, very serious outcomes. So just a couple case histories, and I'm picking on synthetic cannabinoids here, and I'll, at least in the next two cases. But on this one, this is a fentanyl derivative, but I'm picking cases from early on. So this is a case out of Alaska, a 30-year-old. She had a past past history of heroin abuse, was found unresponsive in his bedroom on his elbows and knees. Pretty common scene, syringes and foil. And what was found in the individual is some furanol fentanyl and some butyryl fentanyl, and a little bit of tramadol. So the issue becomes, what role did this play in his death? And again, these cases are early on in the novel psychoactive substance world, and trying to interpret them is difficult. But when we see the word fentanyl and we see somebody was injecting and they're found dead at the scene, you know, that's a little bit easier than when we look at these kinds of cases. And the first one is a decedent found lying prone on the floor in his bedroom, last seen alive about 14 hours before being found, had a learning disability for what it's worth. And what was found was some of the earlier substances, JWH 122, 210, and AM 2201. And the concentrations aren't magnificent here, and it's even before I think we had quantitative techniques, at least in this case. And of course, we had the bloody froth from pathology and little cardiomegaly. So the cause of death in this case was signed out due to the adverse effects of these substances. And I will tell you that early on when these findings started to come out, pathologists were having trouble or weren't all that willing to list these as the cause of death because there was nothing else to compare it to. The knowledge was limited. But all of a sudden, later on, as time progressed and there was no other cause of death, these things started to be assigned as the cause of death. And I think that's still true to today. I know it is. And another one of these cases on the right side, AM22 being found. And these are mono-intoxications, no other drug substances. And I think it's reasonable, especially with what we know today, that when these cases were signed out as causes of death, they were probably correct. So my conclusions here, as forensic scientists, forensic toxicologists, in the post-mortem world, make sure that your analyses are solid, that they're good, you validated them according to standards that are meant to be met, and that you've done a good job with that. Understand the pre-analytical and analytical variables that can affect interpretations. Failure to take those into account can have disastrous results. Understand the science as best you can, as best as we know it, as it stands today, especially around novel psychoactive substances, when knowledge may be a little bit limited, but if you stick to your toxicological roots, perhaps that will help you. Approach interpretations carefully, holistically, and as part of a team, and you'll get much closer to the truth. Don't feel pressured to give an opinion if you can't generate one. So again, though, don't walk the fence. It's either a yes, a no, or I don't know. They're your three choices that you get. And remember that your decisions have some very significant consequences. I want to thank you for attending, and I look forward to joining you a little bit later in terms of the roundtable, and please enjoy the rest of the session.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Middleberg.